we got some pretty big gravel events coming up on the calendar. The Tracker being one of them next month, and I believe Unbound as well. And I just wanted to ask you a few questions for those who might be at home in the process of training, or maybe they're thinking about hopping into some training late for these events. People are also doing like some crit racing right now or some road racing. So for riders that may be balancing the crit racing or shorter road racing events, what would you say are the key differences in training for doing that versus doing an ultra endurance gravel race like the Tracker or Unbound? And then how should riders either transition to or try and balance both of their training schedules when they're trying to prep for events like these?
Yeah, well, again, thanks for having me. This is all kind of top of mind because, well, one, the season's like underway. It is in full-fledged underway. And a lot of the big gravel stuff is really kicking off. Like there's been a couple UCI events. There's Gravel Earth Series. The Hills is tomorrow, which one of my athletes is doing. But yeah, you're talking about Tracker, which I have an athlete doing as well. And then Unbound, I have several. So it's kind of this exciting, true prep period of time. But the interesting, like I always thrive with athletes. I like really enjoy working with athletes that juggle multiple things. So they like doing maybe road races or crits or stage races on top of doing something like Unbound and Tracker. And it's a difficult thing to juggle because they are very different in demands. So you need to kind of step back and look at, all right, well, I've been training for let's say 60-minute crit, very intense, very short, fairly, I guess, simple to recover from. And then you need to go into the event sharp, and you need to go into the event ready to go and ready to hit high intensity power. But when you switch gears and you look at an event that is 9+ hours, that's a big shift in demand. It's
huge.
It's massive. So, and then you go into all sorts of different things. You're looking at mechanisms that are taking place within your body, and then you've got just like the fact that you're going to be pedaling for 9 hours straight, regardless of what that output then is. So you're looking at the mechanics of it. You're looking at like, all right, injury prevention for something like that, which I think is one of your questions later. And then you're looking at the ability to fuel for something like that. And in a 60-minute crit, you might take on a little bit of fuel, but not to the same degree that you would as far as detail going into something of this magnitude. So I do think the switch of training is really appropriate and really important. And if you don't do it, you're kind of setting yourself up for a pretty miserable day. Or to not be able to do it at all. So
right.
What I would say, if you're really in this space where you want and need to balance both, the biggest thing is just finding sections within your training plan to put specificity towards those long duration races. So the ultra events. I'm a big fan of singular overloads, and you need to do those with progressive overloads. So what I mean by that is a single day that is of longer in nature. So it might be like, if you're just starting out and you're used to doing 60-minute sessions, it might be something like 4 hours where you're just like, all right, I'm going to go out and just ride gravel for 4 hours. I'm going to maybe add a little bit of intensity or tempo into the climbs, but then in general, just focus on expanding my endurance. Right out of the gate, that means immediately starting to focus on fueling and training your gut to handle the extra demands for that longer duration of time. You're also working on your ability to just be comfortable for that duration of time as well. But there's a lot of pathways that you're also training within endurance there that are super important. What I see some athletes make a mistake of is, oh, hey, I've got Unbound in 2 months. I'm going to do a 7-hour ride tomorrow or an 8-hour ride tomorrow, and I'm just going to like wing it and go for it. And then what happens inevitably, if you haven't done anything over like 3 hours or 2 hours, for example, is it takes you like a week, 2 weeks to recover from that. And then you've basically stepped back your training 2 weeks. So it is important to build through that. And then, if you accomplish a 4-hour, you give yourself a little bit of recovery. You can jump back into your intensity. I would definitely load in a little bit more recovery before jumping into that intensity. And then you can kind of stagger that out. So maybe a 2 weeks later, you might do a 5-hour session, or 4 weeks later, you're doing a 6-hour session. And then you're kind of growing that out based off of the duration that you need, whether that's Traka or Unbound or another endurance event like that. And then the closer you can get to that, the better, to a degree. It's kind of like marathon training, where you don't really need to be doing a marathon ahead of a marathon. So you can kind of cap the duration, because in general, you're trying to train, again, those pathways, and then your ability to tolerate that long fatigue and dose of stress. But to a degree, like, you need to also keep in mind, how am I going to recover from this? And do I really need to ramp it up to, like 10 hours or something like that? Can I get close enough within proximity that I'm really training my body and stepping my training forward and giving myself the best preparation, but not making myself need to recover for 2 weeks and step my training back? So it's a little bit of a fine line between the two. But I think that's really the way I try and guide my athletes who are trying to play that juggle. I'm also a big fan of saying, all right, we need to make the switch now. So, all right, fair enough. You want to do Unbound and you want to do a crit calendar. Fine. But maybe there's a period of time where we say, okay, crits are no longer the priority. Unbound is now the priority. So I'm switching here to where I'm going to bring my racing schedule down, and maybe I still keep a few in the calendar to keep that primed and that kind of race mentality going. But I focus maybe a little bit more work on efficiency, buffering, endurance, like maybe the lower proximity zones, and that would help that. So I really like to pick like key brackets of time that we're making the transition solely to focus on maybe the ultra event versus having the juggle. If you do the juggle, you're probably going to kind of cut yourself short on both for that duration that you're doing it. As you get further in the progression towards an ultra event, you're probably going to be burning yourself more on the VO2 side than you might like. So I think it's worth it to make the call at a certain point. Usually it's a couple months out, but obviously at least a month out, I would say.
That's what I was going to ask. How far out would you make that call? And then to that, like, are you doing that multiple times throughout a year with an athlete? Say somebody who does crits, but they also have multiple ultra events on the calendar other than just one, like Belgian Waffle Ride or the Traka in this case.
Yeah.
Are you toning down the high intensity type racing multiple times a year to focus on the long endurance events?
Yeah, I've got this is like the stuff that I love to play with. It all depends on spacing, and that goes back to having conversations at the beginning of the year about what your calendar is going to be and making sure that you space it out appropriately. Honestly, best case scenario, you want several builds ahead of an A race or an event that's really important. And having a smattering of smaller events on the way to it can be done in the right way without deterring the plan towards your larger events or those maybe ultra events. But I would say like you can do it several times in a year, as far as like, let's say, for example, I've got an athlete that had a race in January that was a road race that they really cared about, or a stage race, which is this is actually an example of an athlete that I've had. And then they wanted to do Unbound, and then they wanted to do a crit series, and then they wanted to do Big Sugar, which is an event at the end of the year. So then I made sure that there was enough space in between those appropriately that we could actually accomplish real stimulus overload and be able to change their basically what they're able to respond to and what they're able to be good at. Because I think a lot of times the volume, it's like, I don't want to say this exactly because it kind of depends. It's different for if it's a pro or if it's somebody that's juggling their day-to-day life. But for the most part, volume is fairly easy to just inflate. But then it's that in return costs something, and that might be VO2. So you do need a little bit of like breath to be able to retune towards a different goal. And that balance is really tough. But I think it's fairly easy to switch gears twice in a season if you can have the events at the right cadence. That's the hardest part.